The pitter-patter of rain can certainly be comforting on a dark night whilst trying to fall asleep. But it can also be used as a smokescreen for those out to get you. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. The ocean is a beautiful and thoroughly dangerous place. I learnt this the year of my 21st birthday while serving aboard a frigate in the United States Navy. My ship and my home. The USS Clifton Sprague. It was a guided missile frigate. As Navy ships go, she was not very big, frigates being the smallest ships of the line in the fleet, measuring only 445 feet from stern to stem. She was a good ship though, and we had a commanding officer who fully intended to prove it, due to his determination to show what a fine ship he had. I found the ship and myself steaming full speed into the teeth of a storm, which raged off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in the North Atlantic in late fall of 1988. The weather reports were saying that Tropical Storm Keith had not dissipated as expected, but had pushed further north than any other storm that season. Late November was too late to be weathering a storm in the frigid North Atlantic. I thought of all the stories I had heard about how the Canadian Navy was supposed to welcome us to this multinational fleet NATO event that we were to attend in Halifax. I had also heard that Canadian girls were friendly and that Canadian ships supposedly had beer pubs in them. But at that moment, I had no way to prove either of these two superstitions true, because instead of a warm woman or bar stool, I instead found myself perched atop my frigid ship's bridge, standing a forward lookout, watching in a driving sleet storm, with 30-knot winds in heavy seas. What I was certain of was that I was wearing 7 layers of clothing, most of it labelled extreme foul weather gear, and I was still learning about what freezing to death means when it's not just an expression. Upon reviewing the newest weather advisors, the captain had decided it best remain at sea, because a ship in port during a storm merely gets beaten up against a pier until either the ship or the pier breaks. Since Canada routinely has lousy weather, they build sturdy piers, so we took our chances with the storm. Just after noon, the winds and the sea begin to really pick up, and soon we were in that undulating mode wherein one only really gets to test the durability of their sea legs and their stomach. As I had walked through the ship from my berthing space towards my watch station earlier in the evening, I had paid little heed to the fact that sometimes my footfalls landed on the deck, and sometimes on the bulkheads of the ship rocked beneath me. I also paid no notice to the ever-present sounds of the ship, the jet whine of the gas turbines, the thrum of the waves on the hull, the comforting hum of the generators, or even the occasional ping from the sonar. My attention was on the smells from which one learns to pick up great deals of information. I noticed that sometime tomorrow, the galley would be serving blueberry pie. The smell of the fuel oils, sampled with the oil lab, seemed lardy enough for me to know that the fuel level in our tanks was much lower than it should be in a storm. The smell of hot coffee from the mess decks filled my nostrils as I tanked up my cup, and the combined aromas of paint, sweat, and cigarettes rounded out my card-playing shipmate's contribution to this nautical bouquet. I walked the rest of the ladders, and a passage towards the bridge through the warm, welcoming, almost uterine interior of the ship. It was lit in soft red light to preserve the lookout's night vision. How I now missed that warmth and light amid the dark, cold, wet misery of my bridge-top watch station. My face crusted with ice around my nose and mouth. I swept my goggles off and spat into them, hearing the small snap as the spittle flash froze to the glass. I quickly tried to rub it around before it froze too solid, then disgustedly jammed the things on top of my head between my scalp and parka hood, where they might warm a bit. I knew my vision wouldn't last long without them, in the most inhospitable of environments. The sea rolled like a great grey blanket, being shaken out onto an even greater bed, usually appearing solidly black as night. Now every wavy surface seemed to be alive with foamy phosphorescence, so great was the sea state. The distance between the crest of a wave and its adjacent trough was easily 35 to 40 feet. I had never seen 40-foot waves at sea before, and I wished that I had saved that first time for a ship a bit more substantial than the tin can I called home. I had only been going to sea with our Navy for a little over a year at that point, but I was well aware that the floor of the North Atlantic was profusely littered with rotted and rusting monuments to mankind's hubris. As I pondered this, squinting through salt-frozen lashes at the glowing and roaring wave tops, the sea looked and sounded to me like nothing more than a great grinder, ready to pulverize me ship and all. It was at that moment that directly ahead of the ship, a brilliant stroke of lightning struck down into the wave. But this was not just any wave. Mariners call them rogue waves. This wave, larger than any around it, towered 50 feet higher than our main deck. This wave was a killer. Time stood still. Framed in that bolt of lightning, which seemed to claw its way down into the sea, forking and branching and turning that monstrous wave into a giant mountain of emerald and jade with its glowing striations. In an instant, its horrible beauty was gone, forever burned into my memory, but lost into my retinas, and replaced with after-image blindness. I smelled the ozone from the lightning. I screamed, "Rogue wave, death ahead," into my comm, but the bridge crew had seen it as well. Who could miss a giant, glowing, green mountain, which was about to fall on you? I was blinded, but through the soles of my boots, I felt the sensation you get at the beach when an incoming wave pulls the water from under your sandy feet towards the sea. Except this was a lot bigger than a beach wave, and I felt the deck drop out from under my feet as millions of tons of water rushed to feed the behemoth. The ship practically fell into the wave bow on, and as she ploughed in, the wave broke over where I stood, 3 stories up from the main deck. If not for my safety strap, I would have been lost, as over 100 feet of bow forwards of the superstructure speared into that wave. And when the green water broke over the windbreak, it was like colliding with a wall. The hull rang from the impact. The ship lost almost all forward momentum, and for a moment, I felt she might be foundering. The bridge crew told me later that the bridge windows were briefly totally submerged, and for that unnerving moment, they had all looked up to see the surface. But then the ship began to groan and shudder along with her whole length as she shouldered upwards, shedding countless tons of water from her decks. Ship and crew had survived. There were other waves that night, but I was positive that I knew which one had left the inch-wide cracks in the superstructure. I came to know that the ocean is very deadly, and its alluring beauty and magnetism are rivaled only by its brutality and mercilessness. When I was 11, I became severely anorexic. The hospitals in town at the time tried everything, including feeding tubes in my nose, and nothing could get me to eat. So my parents heard about this hospital in Chicago, a 2-hour drive from where I lived, that had a good reputation and sent me there. For the next 3 weeks, I had continued to get worse and worse, and it got to the point where I was on the brink of organ failure, and I found out later that I was only a few days away. The doctors working with me were increasingly frustrated and almost seemed ready to give up on me. But one day, this doctor I'd never seen on the floor before shows up in my room. I was on the bed rest at the time due to how weak I was. It looked like a younger guy, like he was just starting out. He walked in, introduced himself as Dr. Dale, and sat down with a box of toys for me, and we just played and talked. The next 2 days are blurry now, but I distinctly recall going to the playroom. This was the children wards, obviously, and playing on the Nintendo and going for a little walk around the floor. Now, I wasn't actually supposed to do this, and one of the nurses actually called him out on it. But he sort of waved his hand, said it was fine, and we went on. The third day, he came back to my room with his hands behind his back, as if he were holding something, and said, "I've got a surprise for you." He had a rhinoceros plushie in his hands, as rhinos were my favourite animal at the time. "I know it's your favourite, and I got it for you at the gift shop," he said. After that, and told me that he had a code blue to see to, and that I may not see him again. And I didn't. But I ate an apple that day, and slowly began to recover for the following weeks. When I was healthy enough to leave, my parents came and picked me up, and asked me where I got the plushie. I told them that Dr. Dale gave it to me. Now, being parents, and realizing that some strange guy apparently is giving gifts to their daughter, they obviously asked the staff who the guy was. Of course, no one knew what I or my parents were talking about. There was no Dr. Dale, and they didn't know where the plushies came from, and assumed it was from my parents, from home. As we were walking out, I had the presence of mind to check the gift shop to see if they had any other plushies. But they didn't, which could be a supply and demand thing, I guess. I made a full recovery, and I haven't had a full relapse since then, almost 20 years strong, and I still have the plushie. Now, as I grew up, I became very skeptical of my experience. Dr. Dale could have been an alias, but who does that? How could no one else have noticed him? And why did he just disappear? Why just me? There were others in the ward at the time too. It could have been a hunger-induced hallucination, or I wouldn't have the plushie. I occasionally visit the hospital website and look for his name, but obviously I come up empty. I still have no idea what happened. I'm still trying to accept that something I just don't or will never understand happened, and it was for the better. A few years ago, a few friends and I broke into an abandoned pathology. It was pitch black in there. So, We pissed right off on the first day. The next day at around 10 PM, we went back, geared up to the brim. Headlamps, flashlights, chalk, bolt cutters and backup batteries. The entrance door was about 5 meters tall and made out of thick, and I mean thick, 10-inch wood. It was unbelievably heavy to open and made a really deep crackling sound. Shit was already scary, but whatever, we thought to ourselves. The building was a 4-story building. 2 basements, 1 ground floor and the first floor. The main corridor was at least 30 meters in length, with around 8 doors on each side and at least 5 meters wide. The ceiling was about 4 meters high. Same thing on the other floors, except the basement. This building was huge, big open rooms, and you felt watched in there. The floor on the ground floor and the first floor was made out of concrete, and there was not much to see there, just empty rooms and graffiti. The basements were a different story. The ceilings, walls and floors were tiled edge to edge. Everything had a white reflective surface. We were scared at this point but kept on exploring. Remember the chalk we bought? We had used it so that we could draw a line on the ground every 2 meters. That way, we can quickly find the exit in case of any spooky shit happening. Good luck drawing on tiles with chalk. So the first basement was built the same as the ground and first floor. Big rooms, long ass corridor, and high ceilings, but tiled edge to edge. Not much to see there, just some candles and circles made out of roses that were dry, so they had been laying there for at least a few days already. Bit spooky, but we kept exploring. Now we get to the second basement. This place was pure madness. Shit was like a maze, no structure at all, as if the architect had a stroke whilst planning the building. No room was the same size. The ceiling was about 2 meters high, and the corridor was just wide enough to barely fit 2 people next to each other. Shit was claustrophobic. Some rooms were just squares with doors on each side. There were no reference points, and we had to remember the turns we made and reverse them. 2 left, 1 right, second door left, and so on. Heart pounding and scared shitless. Clear thinking was critical, and every tiny noise there made us hold our breath, and we never felt so helpless before. But the good shit is yet to come. We made our way through the maze and got pretty good at remembering the place. At one point, we all stopped and went silent. There was a big ass door secured by a padlock. Should we open it? One of my friends asked. Dunno. What if they keep zombies in there? We laughed, and I pulled out the bolt cutters. It took a few attempts, but I cracked the lock and opened the door. The room was filled with shelves, and the shelves were filled with files. And the files were filled with probably every person that was ever cut open there. The room was stuffed to the brim with autopsy reports. We packed our shit and went home. Shit was enough for us. What gave me chills was that the whole building was empty, but they kept the files there? I mean, the building is in use again, still a pathology, but why keep the files there? Why throw out everything that's not important and keep the files? Finding all that information about people, everything just left there in the bottom after a maze, leaves me confused and concerned. For a couple of months last year, I lived in South Africa and did marine research with some of the people who make Shark Week. The work involved sailing out each morning, attracting sharks to the research vessel, which is around 21 feet with 2 engines, and then collecting data about them by various means. Going into this project, I had very little knowledge of marine biology, and as a result, I was usually relegated the role of chummer. This lucky individual has the role of grinding up large quantities of rotting sardine heads and continuously pouring them off the side of the boat to attract white sharks. My experience took place on the first time I went chumming. It was a beautiful summer morning, and we had just set out in one of the primary research locations, a reef colloquially referred to as Shark City by the locals. The seas were unusually rough, and we were reaching quite large waves hitting the beach, about 1/3 of a mile from where we had laid anchor. The process of grinding up rotting fish involves the chum dance, standing in a rectangular container in a pair of rain boots. I was crushing the fishy remains whilst dancing to Michael Jackson's Thriller, a favourite amongst the researchers. Just as the chum dance reached its finale, a fair amount of rotting sardine was in the water. The crow's nest spotter hastily points to a white glimmer just a few feet from our starboard side. We had gotten lucky. A 15-foot female great white had come to investigate the fishy carnage. Contrary to popular belief, white sharks don't circle boats near the surface with their fins above water. They are indeed ambush hunters, swimming in sporadic patterns around prey, diving to depths below sight, and then eventually striking in a rush from below. We researchers, me in particular, considering I had never even seen a shark before, were giddy as this large female made a few loops around the vessel before disappearing into the iron green abyss. About a minute later, as I was peering off the side, still standing in the chum container, I noticed that the jovial South African laughter behind me had abruptly stopped. I turned around to see a large wave, about 10 to 15 feet, coming in quickly on our broad side. In the few seconds before adrenaline set in, I remember seeing the wall of water crashing over me, spinning, floating. I had been flung overboard by the freak wave. Dear listeners, at this point in the story you must consider who I was at the time. A jet-lagged, somewhat nerdy, skinny American teenage boy, outside the USA for the first time. There I was, floating in the South African Sea, a couple thousand miles from home, in a cloud of rotting sardine matter. Ah yes, the chum container had been flung off the boat with me, with a 15-foot great white shark swimming probably a few yards below. I have very little memory of the next few seconds, a mind clouded by adrenaline. My salvation came in the form of a large arm that pulled me back aboard the boat, which had luckily not capsized. Oh, what a joyous breath of salty ocean air I breathed then. I can think of a few good things that came out of that sharky episode. For one, it accelerated my getting to know the researchers who, presumably, as a result of our mutual peril, welcomed me with open arms for the rest of my time in Africa. The large shark, which has been seen regularly to this day in Shark City, was named after me. Finally, this experience gave me the opportunity to share this notice with you all. Sharks are incredible creatures. They should be respected, admired, and protected. I'm not going to tell you that they should be feared. They definitely should be, to a healthy extent. However, when you consider how many people are killed each year in shark attacks, versus how many sharks are slaughtered for sport, trophies, or fins, you realise that we are indeed the greater threat to them than they are to us. You've probably heard all of this before, but I think it's still worth it to say. I worked as an agency nurse in a small country hospital for a while. We got a call from a nursing home saying one of their patients was going downhill. We went through all the motions, got the ER bed ready. The doctor was also waiting. The EMT pulls up, and they're actively doing chest compressions. The paramedic is breathing for him with an ambu bag or bag valve mask. The doctor asks why he wasn't intubated, as the drive was around 30 minutes from the nursing home to the hospital. The paramedics just said, "You can try if you want, but he won't move his head." The doctor asks me to get a rolled up blanket to place under his shoulders. It makes it to where the doc can see the vocal cords, so he can intubate the patient. I placed the blanket under his shoulders, and his head is floating off the stretcher, like he's doing a crunch or something. I applied pressure to his forehead to push his head down, but it didn't budge. I pushed hard enough, to the point where I thought, any harder and I'm gonna snap this guy's neck. Keep in mind, he flatlined this whole time, and we're continually having to give him breaths with the ambu bag in between all of this, but he's basically gone. The doc gets up, pushes down on his head, and hears a snap. The head goes limp. The doc pronounced the time of death, and it will be a sound I'll never forget. It was actually very close to the noise you hear in movies when someone breaks someone else's neck. The doc ordered an x-ray after it was all said and done, and his neck snapped at C4 to 5. A clean break. We called the nursing home to let them know he had passed. I asked the nurse to read me off his history. He had ankylosing spondylitis combined with a stroke. He didn't move or get out of bed. Laying still without movement for such a long period of time removed the flexibility in his neck and caused his cervical spine to basically fuse. When we applied pressure to his forehead, we snapped his neck. It's the worst feeling ever when you do more harm than good. I am a 33-year-old female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone, which we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook, which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, and I am on a retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so once or twice a week, we have to go to a city with Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us are involved in social media and know very little about the most common apps on phones, mostly because we don't have smartphones. Last summer, we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscape. It does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit. There were a few basic laws and guidelines, but there was no checked-in need. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul. But on day 1, we were preparing to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like a kind of animal trail, and about half a mile out, we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others prefer to be more social, and we are the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zipped and closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. However, there was no sound or movement. We assumed the green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped and never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about green tent guy, until nearing the end of the 5-day trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off in the trail when we came upon the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. This time, the tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again. Nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying that it was weird and that perhaps someone is hurt. I didn't like the idea from the go-get, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, we'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy and carry guns. But my boyfriend assured me we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed to keep the peace and be on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over for the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and quite honestly, I didn't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell became. I know for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them, covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest. It was a mess. Inside was the body and the head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the anus and vagina was covered in dry blood and agape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary, broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point, the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained, green and white, frigid kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was, "What the hell?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could, until dusk was fully on and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail, and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps until after full dawn. We just sat there whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking that at any moment, a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints, know we were there, and track us back to our tent. Let me tell you, I have never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out, off the park, to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and looked very freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point, we hadn't exactly thought about it, but assumed it had just been shot. But because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound. But we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and have never approached an unmanned tent again. I circumnavigated the globe from the ages of 23 to 25 on a 43-foot sailboat. One of the freakiest incidences we had on board was when we were leaving Singapore in the middle of the night. Aside from the constant game of Frogger dodging freights on our path, it was fairly straightforward. At around 3 AM, I was alone at the helm, with everybody else asleep down below. Suddenly, I hear a beep from the radar, which had been set to warn about anything within a quarter of a mile from our vessel. Looking around, I couldn't find anything obvious within that range, so I put the boat on autopilot and went down below to investigate. Typically, other ships show up as little blobs, but for some reason, the radar was registering a long solid line the length of the screen directly in front of us, and it was getting closer fast. Heart racing, I went back on deck to see what could possibly be registering as such a bizarre signature. Eyes slowly adjusting, I looked into the dark, peering as hard as I could to make out something, anything, and then I saw it. Not more than 100 yards ahead was a 20-foot high, unlit, rock-solid wall, right there in the middle of the ocean, looming, and by this point, making its presence known by the sound of waves lapping against it. I was absolutely petrified. Mind you, this was before chart plotters were widely used, and we were navigating with paper charts. I was utterly confused and supremely terrified. I called all hands on deck, and we stopped the boat dead, pulled down the sails and started the engine. Slowly, painstakingly, we picked our way through what was by that time increasingly apparent, a full-on construction zone. Our charts were only 2 years old, but apparently Singapore had undergone a monumental land reclamation, or perhaps nuclamation, since it had never been there to begin with. Even once we found our way out, nobody slept for the rest of the night. To this day, the image of magically appearing dark walls in the middle of the ocean still haunts my dreams. I am an ER vet nurse. We've got the advantage over human medical staff of being able to euthanize in terminal cases, or where we can't afford to treat. I am very grateful for that ability. I can't imagine working somewhere where the ability to give that final mercy would be taken away, because sometimes it is absolutely necessary. Sometimes there are things we can do, but the question has to be whether we should do them for the animal's sake. Some of my worst cases that I've ever had to nurse are ones where the animal should have been euthanized, but we've been unable to get the owner's permissions. For example, a 6-month-old Rottweiler puppy that gave itself grape toxicity at 3 months and ruined most of its kidneys pulled through that episode by a hair's breadth, after weeks in hospital on fluids. It was allowed to get into grapes again, gave itself acute on chronic renal failure, and bloods indicated renal values off the charts, even with dilution. Basically, meant total kidney failure. Short of hemodialysis and new kidneys, this dog was already dead. It just hadn't actually died yet. Owner point blank refused to euthanize, even after multiple vets explained that their dog had a 0% chance of survival, and its remaining time would be in the hospital cage, surrounded by strangers, suffering extreme nausea and crippling pain until it died. They still refused. We drugged it up to its eyeballs and spent 2 days watching it die. I'm glad I never had to interact with the owners, because I have never wanted to punch someone more than I wanted to punch them. There was also a cat, in such severe respiratory distress that it needed to stay in the same position and take 16 gasps for breath per minute, or it would suffocate, even on 50% oxygen. I had to watch it for nearly 10 hours of a 12-hour shift. Poor girl had to pee where she sat, because moving took too much effort. Couldn't eat, drink, sleep, couldn't even lay down. It took another 16 hours or so of the same, and us trying every treatment we could think of, with no success, before I snapped and told the vet that we had to speak with the owners again about quality of life, because I couldn't sit there and watch the cat fatigue its way to respiratory failure overnight. The final story was a dog that had eaten slug bait and was having non-stop seizure activity for 30 minutes before it arrived. Non-stop seizures basically cook the body from the inside, as well as causing hypoxic brain damage. The dog was 42 degrees when it arrived to us, and probably had been there for over 5 minutes, so chance of functional survival were extremely slim. The owners wanted to give it time. Fair enough, it's a shock, we get it. But the dog went downhill, and nothing we could do was helping. We were just throwing their money at a dead dog at this point, and they turned off their phones. I spent 12 hours sitting with that dog, watching it shit out its gastric lining, which, for the record, looks like period chunks and smells like death. Watching it unconsciously vomit up cups of slug bait, putting it on a ventilator, because they said that they wanted all measures taken when we could contact them. Knowing everything I did was futile. They euthanized it 3 hours after my shift finished, when we could finally contact them again. But I still can't look at that bright slug bait turquoise blue without feeling sick. I don't want to finish this episode on a bad note, so let's finish with some positive stories. We had a working dog come in for chronic respiratory problems, and imaging was just not giving us enough information. Something was iffy with his right lung, and there was air around it. So he went to surgery to figure out what was going on, and we found a massive hole in his lung, like an inch long, just freely leaking air into the chest. Being a working dog on a farm, they're worth a fair bit, but we needed to take out the entire lung, and chances of him going back to work were slim. Fully expecting them to call it on the table. Nope, we do the surgery. So we did. Out comes the lung. We wake him up hoping he can breathe well. We wake him up with a 40% reduced lung space. He's doing super well on supportive oxygen, and the next day was back on room air. He continued to make a fantastic recovery. No complications, and I hear he potters about his farm doing little jobs every now and then, and getting spoiled rotten in between. We also had a cat come in, whose owner insisted that something was wrong, even though he was showing really vague signs. After a bunch of diagnostics, we unfortunately diagnosed cancer, but we caught it ridiculously early because his owner was so astute, and she was willing to go for chemotherapy too. Chemo in animals is all about patient comfort, so we use lower doses and make sure they're not nauseous or in pain during, and he's doing really well. He boards with us every so often when his mum goes away, and it's a year out from diagnosis now. Everything is still under control, without her being so onto it, and without being able to do the diagnostics, he wouldn't be here in reasonable health. We also have a few miracle dogs that have survived major injuries through dog attacks. The biggest one was a little Griffin Affenpinscher cross. Looks a bit like an Ewok, but like 4 kilograms. Spent about 6 weeks in the hospital with us after a bigger dog grabbed her by the chest, broke some ribs, and punctured her lung. Nearly killed her outright, but she pulled through. Then she got wound infections and had to have more surgeries. Started off as this horrid dog that tried to bite us for anything, but by the end of her time, she was letting us all do full bandage changes and wagging her tail. Her owners used to come by with a full picnic basket and take her out for a few hours for a picnic in the dog walking area. They lived 3 hours away, but did that every weekend without fail, and she made a full recovery. Her bill would have been thousands, but there was no doubt in these owners' minds that they would do whatever it took to help her recover. The little dog went home, and they send us cards every so often. I have spent a lot of time at sea, fishing, usually only for a 5 to 8 hour journey within 25 kilometers of shore. But I have also worked on long-line commercial vessels that stayed out at sea for 3 to 6 days at a time, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from shore. Nevertheless, the scariest moment for me, ever, was probably when I was around 12 years old, fishing with an old friend of my grandpa. He was a lifelong fishing expert and a local, at 80 odd years of age. What he didn't know about local fishing wasn't worth knowing, although he only used hand lines. He had some kind of commercial license that allowed him to sell his modest catch. Since we shared a strong enthusiasm for fishing, and he could sell what I caught, minus a fish or two, he regularly let me come out with him. It was a clear day, and the water was calm. We were in a fairly small craft. For simplicity, imagine Popeye's boat, the Olive, a diesel-powered, mid-engined boat with a deep hull, small cabin, and very short overall, maybe 7 meters, 22 feet. We anchored about 2 kilometers from shore in about 45 meters of water. Our target was usually snapper. These guys can grow to over a meter long and weigh up to 20 kg. Amazing fun on a handline. I used gloves. He didn't. Anyhow, during a lull in the action, I was daydreaming and staring over the edge of the boat in the depths below. It took me a moment to register when I realized a large shape passed under me. It was deep enough that I had only got an outline and sense of movement. I paused and stared. What had I just seen? Then the tail passed. My heart stopped. My blood turned to ice. I realized I had been staring down onto the back of an animal so large that I had temporarily thought it wasn't actually there. It was so large that my mind had time to run through a series of processes before I realized something was still passing me, and there goes its tail. Roy? I think I just saw a shark, I stammered. Of course, this was not unusual, and we regularly pulled them on board. But there must have been some extra information etched on my face that he registered. I was probably as white as a ghost. So Roy gets up and starts looking around. For a minute, there was nothing to be seen. We took turns looking over each side of the boat. And there it was, a real-life monster. An enormous 7-meter great white shark. I can still recall the feeling of 12-year-old horror. It looked up at me. It saw me. Its face and head were covered in scars, and there were many old injuries all over the entirety of its body. For me, nothing I have experienced since can compare to the eye-to-eye encounter for sheer terror. It passed under the boat again. My panic was escalating. In what seemed like an instant, the old man Roy was raising the anchor. It was then I realized he was almost as scared as I was. My bladder almost let go. How could he be scared? We are safe, aren't we, Roy? It can't get us up here, right? That is the one that rams boats, boy. And I can't swim. Now, as an adult, I understand that a shark would have a hard time capsizing such a vessel. But that did not change the fact that I was 12 years old, and I had just a face-to-face encounter with Satan, who was currently under the boat. And that was that. In moments, we were puttering back towards port, far too slowly. I think I still have PTSD almost 3 decades later, and I still search the water for the shark, even today. I was exploring this old, still functional golf course near where I lived, out in the middle of nowhere. It was huge. As they expanded, other parts of the course were closed and roped off. I knew a kid who used to work there. It was a place a lot of local kids would work from the ages of 14 all the way to college. It was easy work and good money. And he told me how even maintenance didn't go to the old parts. Not because of some creepy backstory, but because they just found no need. It was a short walk from my house through the woods, so I'd go back there from time to time over the years to jump around and sit in all the old golf carts and just be weird. At this time again I was 16, and I hadn't been back there in about 4 years. I'm bored, and my gal pal isn't answering the phone, so I decided to go around the woods and look at the golf course again. I make my way around the opening in the woods. The way there was odd. You walked through a small cluster of trees that opened into a large circular swamp. At this time of year, the swamp was hard, not frozen, but cold enough so that you could walk over it with boots. I walked to the island in the middle, which had a sort of dirt path over this swamp to the abandoned part of the golf course. And that is when I saw the tent. It was rickety, in the middle of a tall field of grass. You couldn't see it from above off the cliff, and could only see it from an angle. Even then, you could only really notice if you were paying attention, as it was in the actual swamp, on a huge wooden board. I stop, listen, and I can't hear anyone. So against my better judgment, I opened the tent to check out what's inside. I wish I had the pictures, as this was before phone cameras. The top was torn open and covered with a clear plastic. It was one of those gigantic tents that have the main room and the two side rooms. I could see all right with the huge tear, and immediately noticed the floor is littered with pocket-sized notebook papers, and they all had things like the names of fictitious characters scribbled on them, in what I can only describe as terrifying shaky handwriting. Each had an actually pretty good drawing of any mentioned characters, and, though I was fearless up until now, I felt my heart leap into my throat. My curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked into one of the side rooms. The first room had a sword. Before I could get to the second room, I hear footsteps. I walk out and see this guy hulking towards the tent, having a full-blown, animated conversation with himself. Every so often, shouting or screaming and punching trees. And he was wearing the lower half of medieval armor. I ran like hell, and he didn't see me. I went back to see if he was still there a week or so later, and the whole thing had been burnt to the ground. My wife and I were honeymooning in St. Lucia 8 years ago. The resort we stayed at offered a catamaran cruise to the Pitons. It was great. Free drinks, great scenery, the weather was perfect. And the cruise drops us off at some town to check out the sulfur volcano and waterfall. The time comes to board for the 3 ride back to the resort. I say to my wife, I really want to sit up by the cargo net at the bow to get the breeze and the spray so we can cool off. Of course, she wants to sit somewhere else. We almost break into a mini argument, and while that was going on, another couple grabs the spot. No big deal. We find a spot a little behind where I wanted to be. About halfway back, some kind of game fish leaps out the sea, through the cargo net, and literally into the lap of the guy of the couple who wound up sitting where we wanted to sit. Everyone is kind of amazed at first. Then the guy starts wrestling with whatever kind of fish it was. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. It all happened kind of quick. It was around 3 to 4 feet long and seemed to be about 40 to 50 pounds. After around 4 to 5 seconds, the fish drops back through the net and this guy's wife starts screaming. Blood is pouring out of this guy's leg. Being pretty much right behind him, I got a good look at the 5-inch gash the fish's fins must have put into him. I could see that fatty looking substance and knew things had gone pretty bad. He managed to get his feet diced up too. The boat had to pull off at the next resort and drop off this couple so he could get immediate medical attention. We could hear the sirens making their way towards us as we shoved off again. And to top it all off, we saw him at the airport when we were leaving about 4 days later, in a wheelchair. Not the way you want to spend your honeymoon, but I was glad he made it through. To this day, I still think that my wife or I should have been the ones in the wheelchair, or worse. Safe to say my wife has won every argument that has taken place since this incident. To give you some context, this occurred roughly 14 years ago, when I was 12 years old and living in East Side Australian rainforest. When I say rainforest, our house was on a 40-acre property surrounded by bush. The house itself was owned by a Swiss man named Hans. Occasionally, he would come down with his tractor and slash the long grass surrounding our house so we could access slightly more of the property in the summer. It was extremely handy, because if you know anything about Australia, it's that we have a ton of beasties that can very easily kill you. We lived about a 40-minute drive from the small town centre. This meant that if we needed groceries, medical attention, or to contact our parents, say whilst we were at school, it would be a 40-minute drive before anything could be done. The house sat on the side of a large mountain, roughly 3/4 up, so naturally, most of the land we called home was strewn with valleys, nooks, and hideaways. We had trails we could walk, and they led to a stream and a small waterfall. It was a truly beautiful place, but considerably scary to me and my small siblings. We knew our neighbours on both sides of the property, but because the location of our house was pretty remote, the nearest neighbour was a roughly 10-minute drive away. One was a lovely old lady who used to wave at us when we got off the school bus before we made the trek to our house every day. I think our parents asked her to keep an eye on us. The other was a middle-aged man and his family. He was a real jerk who excavated around the bottom border where our properties met and continuously interrupted the stream and waterfall's clear flowing water supply. Lots of strange and creepy shit happens when you're living in the middle of nowhere, but one in particular involved a guy who I certainly don't ever want to meet again. Being pretty removed from people, it was extremely rare that we ever got visitors who we didn't know were coming. When people who we didn't recognize turned up, it was usually because they were lost and needed directions. One day though, a man came roaring down our driveway. I remember running inside to tell my dad someone weird was here, and he immediately walked out to see who was the unwanted guest. A little background about my dad. He is literally the most hardcore person you'll ever meet. He has one leg after having it amputated earlier in his life after having a motorcycle accident while he was running from the police. He was in the Navy and was brought up in a very strict household. He had grown up in a very rough part of Sydney West, and he has some pretty shady contacts too. In short, he is someone you really wouldn't want to mess with. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd killed someone in his life prior to settling down and having kids. Anyway, my dad goes outside to see what all the commotion is about, whilst my mum keeps us inside being protective. The man has a large, red-furred dog in the back of his car that looks like a German Shepherd cross. It snarled at my dad, but immediately cowered when this stranger told it to shut up. Our own dog Millie, renowned beast killer, was snarling and going ballistic, whilst being chained up to the house. "Hi, my name's Johnny." The way the man spoke was like he was a salesman, a really slick and smooth guy, who on the outside seemed friendly, but with the overtone of wanting something. My dad immediately responded with, "So what the hell are you doing here then, John?" The man was taken aback, obviously not used to dealing with someone as hostile as my dad. Then they talked for a while, and I could hear my dad talk with a sense of confusion about whatever this man had to say. I did, however, overhear my dad say, "What the hell are you thinking? Just call the cops." I found out later that the lovely old lady next to us had died. Apparently John was on the other side of her property and went to visit and found her dead. He also asked my dad if they should move the body to make it easier for police to investigate. This is obviously why my dad was telling the man to call the police immediately. So anyway, later that night the police showed up to take the statement from my dad and John, who was hanging around at our house until the police arrived. I remember my dad pulling an officer aside and explaining that John wanted to move the body before when he first arrived. The police left without any more questions, as it looked like she died from natural causes. John was still at our house, and I found him to be quite an unsettling person. The way he smiled, the dark of his eyes. He was unfamiliar, but acting like he was one of us. I remember it was a school night, and I was trying to watch TV, and he was playing songs on his guitar, with my mum and dad at the table. I was angry, because he was ruining my shows, and I told Mum I wanted him to go, and that I thought he was weird. She smiled and told me she felt the same, and told me I should go to bed. The next day, things seemed normal. We went to school, came home. Not seeing the familiar friendly face of the old woman stung a bit on my way as we passed her house. It felt strange, and I hoped that she knew her family loved her before her passing. I was a bit sad on the walk home, until halfway down the driveway, I noticed John's car again, parked out in the front of our house. I walked closer and was greeted by his dog Rusty. He walked outside with my dad, and I heard him call Rusty to his car as he was leaving. Apparently he was borrowing tools from my dad. He left and waved goodbye, like he was someone I was going to miss. Again, that sense of over-familiarity made me uncomfortable. I didn't know this man, I didn't like this man, and I was hoping he would never come down our driveway again. My dad then pulled me aside and asked me what I thought of John. I labelled him a weirdo, and told my dad that I was hoping he would not come back. For the second night in a row, when John returned Dad's tools, he was sitting in our house playing guitar and annoying everyone. My mum and dad were visibly unimpressed by the situation. I heard my mum and dad argue about him hanging around, until eventually my dad told him that he needed to leave, as it was time for us to go to bed. He insisted it was early, and tried to make an excuse to stay. I found that very odd. I was polite enough to know when someone didn't want me around, so why didn't this man? Or if he did, why wouldn't he leave after ushering him out? My mum and dad had a big talk in their room, and my dad told us all that he didn't like John and that he was going to ask him not to come over anymore, and if we saw him again, to immediately tell him. The next day was a Saturday, so we were going to blow up our big cheap inflatable pool and go for a swim, as it was getting pretty warm. At around 11 AM, the sound of a car thundering down the driveway alerts me, and I go outside. I run back inside to tell my dad that John has returned. Just like the first time I ever laid my eyes on John, my dad goes outside, and we stay inside with Mum, watching and listening through the screen door. John, again with his weird, over-familiar smile and dark eyes, greeted my dad, and is met with, "Look mate, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't want you coming around here anymore. You scare my kids and my wife, and I don't want you to come back. Do you understand?" I didn't hear John's replies from his tone. It sounded like he was confused and tried to reason with my dad. Dad wasn't having it, and told him to go or he would call the cops. As he was leaving, Dad said, Don't come back, or you'll be sorry. This is where things get truly weird, as my dad lays this subtle threat on the man. His face completely changes to one of rage. He glares at us in the house, sticks up his finger, and speeds out of the driveway, shouting profanities and churning up gravel, spraying it towards our house. My dad came back in and told us that we wouldn't be seeing John anymore, and that if we did, we were going to call the police. I was relieved. This odd man was making me feel uncomfortable in my own home, and the way he reacted when he left confirmed the feeling I got when I first saw him. I can't remember if it was Sunday or Monday after that day, but John did come back, and he tried to reason with my dad and say sorry for whatever caused us not to like him. Before he even got out of the car, my dad said, "If you don't turn around and leave, I am going to smash your face in." He did just that. My dad then called the police to inform them what happened. Apparently they were going to go and talk to John. I didn't hear any more of what happened to that conversation. A few weeks went by with no sightings or happenings with John, and we all felt like things were back to normal. This was until our mailbox had been tipped out of the ground and smashed, or possibly run over. I remember asking my dad what happened, but he wasn't about to give me any ideas. He later told me he knew it was John after the last way their last conversation ended. The next weekend after the mailbox incident, we went into the town to get groceries and a fast food dinner as a bit of a treat. And when we came home down the driveway, Dad immediately stopped my mum from proceeding and said that something was wrong. Next to the carport where we parked our car, at the back of the house, there was a window that opened to the bathroom. My dad must have spotted the window was missing. As we drove down, he got incredibly more tense until we all noticed the window was missing. I remember being confused in the back seat, not really knowing what was going on, until I saw it. A man, dark eyes, overly familiar, coming from the window that led to the shower. My dad was exploding with rage. He told my mum to rush down the driveway so that we could mess up this guy. The man proceeded to escape the window and run down the back of our property into thick lantana, which is a really thorny shrub-like plant. My dad, only being on one leg, let Millie loose, and she was going ballistic, tied up to the house. She raced down the lantana-engulfed hill into the darkness. She came back with nothing. My dad went out with a flashlight and couldn't find anything either. I'm not sure if anyone slept that night. None of our possessions had been stolen, or even moved. We must have caught this man just as he was entering the house. The police came the next day and searched for fingerprints with no avail. My father was furious and again alerted them to John and his strange behavior. They told us they would look into it once again. That was the last time we heard from John that year. I had almost completely forgotten about him and had the summer off to enjoy myself and get ready for high school. The school I went to was pretty large, considering where we were, but everyone seemed to know each other pretty well, including the teaching staff. Within the first week of school, we were introduced to all the teachers and teachers' aides. I was caught completely unaware when that overly familiar dark-eyed man from the previous year was reintroduced as a teaching aide, except instead of John, as Greg. I went into a little bit of a spin as I was trying to make sense of it all. I was 100% sure that this man named Greg was the same man who had introduced himself to my family as John. At that moment, so many things rushed into my head. What if he killed the old lady? What if he didn't live nearby? What if he wanted to move the body so he could frame my dad? If he lied about something as critical as his name, what else could he be lying about? What if the police never even made contact with him? I was sitting there for a good 10 minutes trying to piece together until the teacher called my name to bring me back to reality. And that's when he noticed me. The look on his face when he saw mine was one I'll never forget. He immediately recognized me. He looked shocked. His eyes were wide and he said nothing, just staring. I just found out his dirty little secret. I could sense that he was now the one feeling uncomfortable and on edge. Later that day, I rushed home to tell my dad who I found. He was shocked and repeatedly asked if I was sure. He went to school with us the next day and discovered the man had put in for indefinite leave yesterday and may not return. When we learnt of the news, my dad told me to watch out and let him know if John or Greg ever returns. So whoever you are, let's not meet. I was in the US Navy for 6 years, stationed on an aircraft carrier for 4 of those. This is the scariest thing that happened to me. Our ship caught fire off the coast of Chile after a port call there. We were offloading fuel to another ship, and they called over to tell us that we had smoke coming out of the hull, so they were breaking away until we figured it out. A fire is not the sort of thing you want going on during a jet fuel transfer. A few fires started getting called away, so the captain announced that we were going to general quarters. I thought it wasn't serious for a while. Over the past few weeks, people had been calling away the fire team for little trash can fires, so I figured this was just a few of those, coincidentally happening at the same time. After about an hour, I realized that we were still at general quarters, and the announcements were pretty intense. I saw a few people running past, and apparently there was a fire that started in the ventilation ducts and had spread all throughout the ship. I offered help and just started running SCBA breathing tanks back and forth to the refuel stations so the firefighters could keep fighting the fire. We had 4 crewmen that had been trapped at one point, and we had to cut through a bulkhead or an internal wall to get them out. In the end, the worst injuries were just second-degree burns and heat exhaustion. We lost one of the reactors and a lot of office equipment. We limped up to San Diego and were there for 3 months because the repairs were so extensive. After everything was done, I read the report, and based on what I know about the events of that day, it turns out we were a hair away from losing the ship. We had 1 reactor remaining to power the ship, and some of the cabling to the emergency diesel generators had melted, meaning they wouldn't have received a start signal if the other reactor failed, meaning we may not have had enough power to finish fighting the fires. It was a really close call, because we almost lost the reactor a few times. It was down to 2 coolant loops, which is not a very good place for those reactors to be. The fire started because some people were keeping oily rags in a ventilation room and used that room as a smoke pit. Idiots. About 30 years ago, I completed my international medicine training in upstate New York, which included a weekly outpatient clinic and ward rotations at the local VA hospital. I love military history and enjoyed the chance to talk with many World War II veterans back then, and even some World War I soldiers. These were everyday, working class, even humble men who quietly lived common lives, but had participated in some of the most storied and celebrated battles in the last century. They were part of a generation that made tremendous sacrifices and embodied many of our values that made America great. It was my privilege to hear some of the stories of this greatest generation firsthand. One man was in my clinic for over 2 years, so I was his primary care provider for some time. He was a tall, large man with a long white beard, and he always wore a Confederate cap. I always thought the hat reflected a bit of his gentleman's demeanour, with just a hint of rebel in him. He was a simple man who, although I was probably younger than his own kids, always treated me with respect, and he called me Doc, but never with my last name. We got to know each other quite well, as he was in severe chronic heart failure, so I was seeing him in my clinic on a very frequent basis to adjust his medications. One day, he told me his story about the war. It turned out he had served under Patton in North Africa. He described the scene of his last battle, and in my mind's eye I felt like I was there. He was on a high hill, and the Germans had overrun and nearly surrounded his position. Most of his company had been killed or retreated. From his position, he could see the enemy advancing on 3 sides. It was rock and gravel and sand, like the moon. There was dust, and the smell of gunpowder, and the smoke of burning diesel and oil. The Germans could not see his exact location, and so were firing indiscriminately upon the hill. On the other hand, from his vantage point, he could see the terrain well, and was systematically picking off enemy soldiers one at a time, with well-placed rifle shots. His own battle buddy was already down, but he thought still alive. It was only a matter of time before they were both dead or prisoners. Suddenly, the enemy stopped firing, and my friend knew that the Germans were sending a scout to ascertain his precise location and better target his position. He also knew he only had a few moments left, so he picked up his buddy in a fireman carry and started running away from the enemy's position. Had he not been carrying his friend, he would have been able to move much faster. He was nearly down over the crest of the hill that would have put him temporarily out of sight of gun range when he was knocked down. A bullet tore through his left shoulder and upper chest. He fell heavily to the ground with a gaping chest wound, and his friend rolled a short distance completely inert. It was only much later he would find out his body did not survive. His friend was bleeding heavily, but his next breath collapsed his lung, and much of the bleeding slowed. He lost consciousness and awoke in the dark. He wasn't able to get up, and drifted in and out of consciousness all night. The next day, he was picked up by American forces that had reclaimed the territory of the battlefield. His recovery was prolonged, but eventually he would recover, but he never fought in uniform again. He was awarded the Purple Heart, but other more prestigious medals of distinction would never come, because no one ever lived to testify about his heroism. He had not told this story to many people, he said, because he just never enjoyed talking about the war. It was my honor both to hear this story and to serve this true war hero. A lifetime of cigarettes and alcohol had taken a toll on him, as he fought other inner battles, not the kind of fights that were won with guns or violence. When I met him, he was also battling severe health problems. Miraculously, I was able to keep him out of the hospital for a fairly long time. However, eventually things fell apart, and he was admitted and started a downhill spiral. It was after midnight, and he had been in for a few weeks, and just not getting better. I visited him in the ICU, and he knew he only had a short time left. He thanked me for the care I had given him, and then started talking about the war. You know, Doc, I never regretted the things I did, nor those Germans I killed. I knew that if I didn't kill them, they would kill me. But lately in my dreams, I'm seeing the faces of those young German boys I killed. In his last battle, he was going back to his first. Death is the final enemy, and my friend knew he was going to the same place he sent the others to. He died that night. A man I will never forget. Thank you, friend. And also, thanks to all the others who have served, fought, killed, and even died for our safety and freedom. I am an open water kayaker, and I took a trip to Charleston, South Carolina for a weekend of fun paddling around the harbor and the Barrier Islands. There is an inlet between the Isle of Psalms and Sullivan's Island, known as Breach's Inlet, where there have been quite a few deaths due to the extremely strong and unpredictable rip currents. What better place to go play in a boat, right? Part of the trouble with the inlet is that you have the current coming out of Charleston Harbor in one direction, the general coastline current in another direction, and the current flowing out of the inlet itself in a third direction. All of these currents come together and make some fantastic waves to play on. I was in a used Neko Elaho HV kayak I had recently purchased from a closing kayak shop's rental fleet. The boat is about 15.7 feet long, but is surprisingly nimble for its size. Definitely a fun but stable surf boat. Before this incident, I had only had the boat on pretty flat water, inland lakes and large rivers with no real rapids, and had experienced no problems with the boat. The difference here is that with all of the different currents, there were large waves breaking over me in multiple directions. On the lakes I was used to paddling, the biggest waves I might encounter was the wake from a passing redneck in a boat. In Breach's Inlet, I was now faced with 6 to 8 foot waves crashing and breaking from multiple directions, sometimes all at once. I've been here before in my other boat with no problem. This is a fun place to paddle, but I did not realize that this boat had a hidden problem. There is a large watertight compartment in both the bow and the stern of the boat, meant for flotation, but commonly used for storage of equipment. For excursion paddling, each compartment has a hatch cover made of neoprene, with a sturdy bead around the edge, like a bicycle tire, to fit snugly around the coaming of the hatch, and then loosely covered with a hard plastic hatch cover to protect the neoprene. What I didn't realize was that the bead on the rear hatch's neoprene cover had broken, and although it appeared to be holding normally, from a quick visual inspection, it was, in reality, barely able to hold itself in place. In flat water, this wasn't a problem, since waves were not breaking over the top of the boat. There was never any additional pressures on the hatch cover to make the problem apparent. Unfortunately, I am now 3/4 of a mile out into the ocean in the middle of one of the most dangerous currents on the eastern coast, with waves crashing against me regularly. The hatch cover did not hold. There was a noise. There wasn't a shudder, there wasn't a crack. There wasn't an indication that there was any kind of problem. I noticed that it became a little more sluggish to steer, but I initially attributed that to tiring from a long day of paddling. Then I noticed that the waves were crashing over me more and more. At first I thought this was due to the changing tides increasing the wave action, but I slowly began to notice that I was riding lower and lower in the water. I still wasn't too concerned, but I was starting to pay more attention. What finally made me realize I was in trouble was when each passing wave would actually turn me into it as I passed. I was having little luck steering the boat at all. This is when I noticed that the rear deck was almost totally awash. So much of the boat was now underwater that instead of floating above the waves, I was now in them, and they were pushing the boat. Now, I'm 3/4 of a mile out with a boat that is nearly uncontrollable and extremely sluggish and tippy due to the several hundred pounds of water now residing in my rear, non-watertight compartment with 6 to 8 foot waves hitting me in every direction. I can honestly say that this is the only time I have been truly scared in one of my boats. I was not sure I would be able to make it to shore. For every paddle stroke that I tried to make toward shore, I would have to take 3 or 4 more to correct my course from passing waves turning me. Due to the additional mass of water, it took 4 strokes or more to be as efficient as one is normally. It felt like every other stroke I had to brace to prevent capsizing. I was in real trouble. It took me over an hour to reach the shore. That distance in those waters should have only taken about 5 minutes, and I was finally helped the last 50 meters by a passing boat. I had attracted a small crowd on the beach, and not long before I landed, someone had finally thought to call for help. They arrived about 10 minutes after I made it to the shore. I carry a VFH radio with me, but by the time I realized I was in trouble, I couldn't take my hands off the paddle long enough to use it. When I landed, the boat was at a 30-degree angle, since the only flotation I had remaining was the front compartment. The rear compartment was completely filled with water, and I did not paddle this boat again until that rear hatch cover was replaced. It was the summer before my senior year of college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night, I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area or nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself and am a female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friends and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. The area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignoring the sign that says the park closed at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopies of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down. So I lit my way with a mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times, I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to the animal activity. Hopefully, the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch blackness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or not, if I sat right out in the open. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after only about 10 minutes of waiting, was this: a man, dressed head to toe in dark colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come, and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glance around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve, where hunting of any kind was prohibited. At any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deers in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so there were no cell phones, and even if I'd have had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it, lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my higher vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd first heard when I arrived in the woods, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven out on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more about it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car. If he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot, and he'd come after me. I sat paralyzed with fear and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment where he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him shout out loud, "Screw it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd came in, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, and I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of my car with something sharp, presumably a giant knife, that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles to let me see him before he could see me. And thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. Creepy forest rapist murderer, let's never meet again. This story is my grandfather's, who was a chief engineer on a trawler ship operating out of Hull. He was fishing at night off the coast of Norway in the 70s when a call came on radio. Worth noting, it was an open secret that all the radio operators on the trawlers worked for the government and also had sonar equipment to listen for USSR subs, to evacuate an 100-mile area, and if the trawlers could not get their nets up in time, to get the hell out of there, or they should just cut them free, which was very expensive to do when you have dozens of miles of nets out in the water. On the way out, my grandfather's trawler and other trawlers in the area saw a massive white flash on the horizon. After returning to Hull, it was discovered that a ship called the Gaul had never returned and had lost all radio contact around the time of the flash. Fast forward 20 or so years later, and the wreckage of the Gaul was discovered and officially sank because of a waste flow pipe being overwhelmed with a massive wave that flooded the lower compartment of the ship and sent her to the bottom. Rather interestingly, there were no human remains found on or near the ship, nor any equipment, food, bedding, etc., and all the windows had been blown outwards, along with the hole about 3 meters across through the middle of the ship, with all the metalwork being twisted upwards towards the sky. My grandfather always insisted, up until his dying day, that the sea that night was as still as a pond, and that his radio operator was fairly sure that the "get the hell out of there" warning came from the Gaul, as well as the time of Gaul sinking. 16 unknown graves were created and filled in Murmansk, Russia. Another one of his favourite stories was that one day the engine for hauling in nets was redlining and came very close to exploding, so had to be shut off, as they assumed the nets got stuck at the bottom. A few minutes later, a Soviet sub surfaced from beneath them, with the nets stuck to the periscope, complete with a bunch of very pissed off Soviet sailors armed with guns, who unhooked the nets and disappeared back under the water. It was a known tactic that Soviet subs tried to sit under the trawlers and use them as cover to get out into the Atlantic, hence a lot of the ships having government-paid radio operators on board. My grandmother developed Alzheimer's around 9 years ago. For 4 years, my grandfather, who was healthy and a horse despite his diabetes, watched her. During the summer following his death, which was an accident, we hired a live-in nurse. She was a horrible person. She would eat the meals that Meals on Wheels would send and leave my grandma to go hungry. She'd leave her unattended to go to the movies, and she'd have her family come to my grandmother's home, eat her food, use her dishware, and just take advantage of everything. Well, it wasn't easy to notice this. We all worked 9 to 5 or were in school, so the nurse would just piss around during the day, until one day when my grandmother, who at this moment didn't know where she was 24/7 and only knew my grandfather's name, who she would ask for constantly, she left her house at noonish when the nurse left her and climbed into my grandfather's pickup truck and drove to my aunt's house. Once she parked the car, she just sat there and slept. Luckily, my aunt got off for work early before the nurse tried to do anything about it. When my aunt got up, my grandma told my aunt that my grandfather, Jeff, said that the Canterbury Centre of Rehab just reopened We investigated the nurse and had her fired and called EPS. Now, I didn't think too much about what she said. We wrote it all off as confused lucidity until her passing. She died 2 years ago today, and she was wearing a neck brace that had a cast on it from a fall which determined she could no longer walk. She only made sounds that were no similar to words. I watched her die as she took her last breath. She reached up towards the ceiling and said clear as breath, "I'm coming." The creepiest thing was that whatever was affecting her, would give her these moments of clarity. She knew she was being neglected in a situation where she didn't even know she had to potty. She knew my grandfather and knew he was gone, and she knew she was dying. My mum, a religious nut, is convinced that my grandfather was protecting her from heaven. I don't know. I just know what I saw and felt. I didn't feel good about it though, like everyone else did. I felt sick to my stomach. It's weird, but you know the feeling of being watched? It was like that feeling. The little hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and your senses start to peak. Prior to joining the US Navy, my grandfather took me aside and told me several stories of his time spent in the Navy during World War II. This was his way of ensuring I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. My grandfather was a weapons technician too in World War II, aboard the destroyer USS Maury, DD-401, from 1942 to 1945, manned a 5-inch over .38 caliber cannon. He survived Pearl Harbor, Battle over Tarawa, and Battle of Midway, as well as the invasion of Luzon, to name a few, with only a small shrapnel wound to his leg in all that time. I'd like to share some of the stories that just blew my mind to this day. August 21st, 1943, in a location west-southwest of Nendo Island, Solomons. The ship USS Maury, DD-401 destroyer. The Maury was escorting an Australian vessel to Espiritu Santo, as Japanese forces were still active in the area, and Allied forces were actively attempting to keep Guadalcanal and the Solomons secure after previous weeks of battle with the Japanese forces. The night was clear, with every star in the sky. The wind was so low that you could hear gulls fishing off in the distance, and the wakes splashing against the hulls of the ships. The air felt like Hawaii in spring, and all you wanted to do was bask in the moonglow. Suddenly, voice radio communications from nearby Allied island bases started chirping away with information about visual confirmation of enemy subs in the area to the north. Soon after, the all-on-deck order was given, and everyone was forced to stand ready. A team was assigned light patrol, and they began panning around looking for subs. Not more than 2 hours go by, with no visual contact made. They are finally given the order to stand down and return to shut-eye duty. Before daybreak, contacts from Nendo Island start coming on voice comms, warning that potentials are flying around in the area just 5 miles south of Maury's escort position. Already worried that they may have been targeted by Japanese subs from their bow, they now have to contend with a potential aerial assault, and everyone is called to stand ready once more. Engines are killed, emergency lights activated, An order is given to kill all lights. My grandfather, manning his light, is immediately ordered to put the candle out and pushes the searchlight straight down into the water, turning it off. When they finally stop moving, the crew can hear the low-tone humming of several planes passing parallel to their position. Everyone holds their breath and pretends to pretty much not exist, hoping the enemy doesn't make visual contact with the ship. So for a good 45 minutes, everyone just sits there until they can no longer make audible contact with their enemy forces they hoped would pass. Finally, after almost 2 hours of nothing, they are given the go-ahead and start the engines and return to the passage. My grandfather flicks his cigarette port side and clicks on the searchlight, still pointing into the water. What he says he saw next aged him and 2 others with him a good 10 years. Below, where the searchlight sat, focused in the water, lay an eyeball the size of a basketball, sitting there, staring straight back at him from about 10 feet underwater. The next 3 seconds lasted minutes in his mind, as he watched this silvery disc of an eye look straight through him. Finally, the first of the engines started in what seemed like forever, and the beast that it was broke surface for a brief moment in order to dive deep. Even before people acknowledged giant squids existed, before they were even caught on camera, my grandfather believed, because he had seen one within 20 feet of his face. In my 8 years of service, I have heard many stories of such things, and even own a few teeth pulled from the rubber liner of a ship, but never had any such experiences myself. Adding that experience in lieu of the drama of war, and you can get a sense for the true terror it would invoke. My grandfather, now 93, is still alive and kicking, even though dementia is heavy, and he seems to live in the past. It's still good to know that there are still some heroes in this world. Thanks to all that served, and thanks for listening. My friends and I used to explore abandoned places for fun. We ended up stopping because we probably could have died. These are some of the most notable experiences that we had. The first was in an abandoned warship. There was this old shoreliner used in World War II that war later used as a vacation boat or something. Some old idiot bought it and shored it up a shallow river, and it was basically left to rot. We had to trek through hillbilly country, past all those trespassers will be shot signs everywhere, as we were definitely trespassing. And one time I went, we would walk right up to it and climb in. The next, the river was high, and we had to wade to it. That messed with me, because we were definitely risking being bitten by snakes or stepping on rust. The ship itself, honestly, was meh. The second incident happened at a giant old radio tower or office building out in the middle of nowhere. There's a building in my city, all brick, probably 10 stories high, in the ghetto. It was used over the years for all kinds of stuff, but it was originally, and mainly, a building for radio station. It was enormous, kind of heavily secured, but we found an open window about a story up that we shimmied into off a pipe. Once we got in, there was definitely the feeling of something being off. It was dark, of course, but it was also unsettling, in that it was so wet. It didn't smell that bad though. The story that we found ourselves on used to be a chapel of some sorts, There were a few pews and an old confessional. Church stuff is scary as hell to find in a dark place, with a cell phone flashlight by the way. We looked around a bit and continued. We climbed up some stairs and into the next story, and were relieved there were more lights. But something was really wrong. This place was pretty clean for an abandoned complex. There was no rubble on the floor, no piles of garbage, nothing. So we kept looking around, and all of a sudden, an alarm goes off. That's when one of my gang saw a bobcat machine. The alarm went off as loud as hell, and that was easily the scariest moment of my life. My heart leapt out my chest and out my mouth. We took off with a singular pack mentality, running for the stairs, but they were bricked in. Afterwards, we all agreed in our collective panic. We all had thought that hobos had wailed on us, but we were wrong. We just went down the wrong stairs. We all ended up leaping from the window that we came from, and got away with a few bruises. It was a rush. The last story is the one that got to me the most. This place was definitely haunted. Or, you know, ghosts aren't real, but there is definitely a body crammed somewhere in this place. So, it's a different, terrible part of town. So, this is in a very different part of town. It's quite rural now, and it's an abandoned complex. I think it used to be a school. Brick with wrought iron interior gates, wrought iron on the windows. This place used to be a pretty secure building. And did I mention it was colossal? We arrived at the destination and want to enter. And as we're trying to shimmy through the window, a woman passing by screams that she's going to call the cops. So that sets the scene to be a little nervous. We get in, and from the offset, we're very confused as to what this place is. Dust everywhere, with odds and ends from everyday life. We entered into someone's old apartment. We carry on, and the atmosphere wasn't very comforting, but I ignored it. Like I said before, the hallways and stairwells have these massive wrought iron gates and tile floors. Nice plaster moulding, hardwood pillars. I doubt this was ever a hoity-toity establishment, but I'm also surprised these nicer old world details survived from the crackhead looters in the era. The hallways were vast, and we all find gunshot holes here and there. Same people would be like, time to leave. But when you're an urban explorer, you're more like, oh wow, danger. So we explore a few more apartments. I go off on my own in a bit, into a closed apartment, because I have absolutely no brain cells. And the first thing I notice are photos. Polaroid photos all over the floor. It hits me that all of these places seemed pretty hastily evacuated. And I don't know how to rationally describe it, but I felt like if I held a ghost sensor thing to these photos, it would explode into a ghost sensing frenzy. At this point my body starts to feel very strange, and I have the feeling that I'm being watched. I look around for my friends, but they've gone off in another direction. So I start walking back to them. I call out. They're nowhere to be seen. I try and keep my cool. I'm a rational dude, and like I said, this complex is pretty big. Just as I'm walking down the stairs, when my foot hits the most bottom step, I swear I hear someone breathe down the back of my neck. I feel it too, but the thing that got me was the fact that I not only felt it, but I heard it. I instantly turn around, expecting one of my friends to be messing with me. But there's nobody there. I run like hell, and manage to find my friends quick smart. We leave not long after, fearing the passing lady would make good on her promise and call the police. I'm glad we did. I'm not sure what happened there, but I know I don't want any more of that in my life. Some years ago, when I was 8 years old, my grandfather asked me if I would like to go fishing with him on his little motorboat, a couple of miles offshore in the Atlantic. It was a beautiful clear day, and after getting the green light from my parents, I was buzzing to go. The allure of spending some quality time with my grandfather on crystal clear waters was too good to resist. 8-year-old me was also thrilled with the prospect of catching a fish. I remember brimming with excitement. I had a friend at school who told me how he had caught a huge fish, and I really wanted to outdo him. I truly expected to have incredible luck and catch a whopper to not only impress my grandfather, my friends, but my whole family. All of these thoughts rushed through my mind as we reached the, quite frankly, underwhelming motorboat. So we jumped in, and he gave me the rundown on what we had to do, and of course, the obligatory safety procedure consisting of stay out the water, don't take the life vest off. He revved up the engine, and away we went, jetting through the crystal sea, leaving waves in our wake as we blasted through. It was almost as if we were flying on the waves. The excitement was palpable. When we finally reached a good spot, we threw out a line and waited patiently. I grew frustrated, catching nothing at all in the first hour, and my disappointment was very visible on my 8-year-old face. I got that feeling that told me that I would never catch anything. I'm not sure why. And then I felt a huge disappointment. I wouldn't be able to outdo my friend. My emotions were very clearly visible on my 8-year-old face, and despite the fact that my grandfather had also caught absolutely nothing, he was still very chipper about the whole situation. I suppose this is probably because he was a seasoned fisherman and understood the complexities of fishing, and that patience is probably your greatest asset. However, being 8 years old, this of course didn't resonate with me at all. Once he noticed the onset of prepubescent moodiness, he decided that we should call it a day. So he tried firing up the engine so that we could leave. And no luck, it wouldn't start. After 15 minutes of effort, and cursing the likes of which I've never heard, he undid the clamp holding the motor on, and dropped it to the bottom of the ocean. At this very moment, I thought he had signed our death warrants, but he pulled out 2 oars from underneath, and then he started rowing back. Unfortunately though, he popped out a mile offshore, and we were being carried rapidly towards some exposed rocks. I knew for a fact that we were in very serious danger, and that hitting them was almost certain, and that drowning would shortly follow. It was by sheer luck that a large motor yacht approached. I started jumping up and down, screaming for help. Our salvation was nigh. But Gramps told me to sit down and shut up. Because apparently it's the law of the sea that if you ask for help, the person giving you aid claimed your boat. So we waited until they offered help and got towed in. If they'd have waited any longer, I'm sure that boat wouldn't have made it back to shore. We made it back fine, but I'll always remember that as the day I almost drowned because Grandpa was willing to scuttle his motor, but not his boat. I'm a paramedic, and I've responded to a ton of strange late-night calls. Murders, suicides, pedestrian versus vehicle, car accidents, trauma, you name it. One of the most insane and sort of creepy calls I've ever been on was an esophageal varix bleed. These typically occur in alcoholics who have abused their esophaguses with years of alcohol contact, causing the vasculature to swell and become softer to the touch. Should a vein rupture, it's a slow, steady bleed, which will fill the stomach until the person literally begins projectile vomiting out their partially digested blood volume. They are often fatal. Anywho, we responded to a sick call, low priority typically. As we pulled into the patient's driveway, his wife was screaming from the front door. She was an elderly lady, literally screaming, "He's throwing up, help him." First thought, okay lady, you're definitely old enough to have seen more than one person projectile vomit in your life. Relax. We made our way into the house, up to the 3rd story of the house where the patient was, and as I turned the corner into the bedroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting bolt upright, pale as a ghost, this 70-ish-year-old man is covered in blood. Covered in blood. It started around his mouth and poured between his legs. His skin was ashen grey, and the blood had partially clotted from his mouth, down his throat, chest, abdomen, and into his lap. Huge clots. He was so very weak he could barely move. So he just reached a hand out to us and moaned, very much like a zombie. He also looked very much like a zombie, and it caught myself and my partner off guard. When we walked into the room, he must have been scared shitless, which we must have furthered by the look of shock on our faces and our eyes meeting his. He realized just how screwed he was that very second. We moved in pretty quickly after we realized what was happening, and each established a large bore IV to quickly get this guy some fluid volume back into his vasculature. Rule of thumb, 3 litres of 0.9 saltine only replace 1 litre of blood, due to the high of viscosity of blood. We ended up stabilizing the guy with a decent blood pressure, but when we got him to the hospital, he caught them off guard too. He coded once or twice in the ER, and I'm not sure if he ended up surviving the ordeal. In 2008, my wife and I left California on a 40-foot sailboat, intending to sail as far west as we could. We spent weeks at a time, without contact from another human being. Shortwave radio was often our only link to civilization, and eventually, we were too south for even that. We passed New Caledonia, and we didn't know what to expect as we approached Australia in the 3rd year of our tour. Of course, the Great Barrier Reef was on our charts, but we were sticking to shipping lanes to avoid grounding. So I was stunned when I took watch one calm morning and noticed a dark brown shape below the horizon. To the west and south seemed to be a massive sandbar or island that had risen out of nowhere. The sea was calm and the winds so light we cranked the engine and motored the last mile to this uncharted barrier. As we got closer, it became clear that it fortunately wasn't above the surface, but it looked like a brown reef or mass of log that was only a few inches below the surface. But how could a reef so massive not exist on any chart? We swerved right and looking for channels or breaks in the bar, but our depth sounder stayed pegged, so we had nothing to guide us through. We had no way of asking anyone whether it was safe to proceed, so when the reef no longer had any gaps to aim for, we tentatively poked the bow into it, with the engine in neutral. No grinding, no shudder, just silence as the reef enveloped us, and our finicky depth sounder still stared back at us blankly. So I ran to the transom, intending to pull on a mask and look below, but then I saw it was just a brownish tint in the water, some chemical or brown oil. Wary that it was a dangerous chemical spill or weapons testing gone wrong, I dipped a bottle into it and tried to sample it without getting any on my hands. We continued puttering through this ocean of brown for miles and miles, before it eventually dropped away behind us as abruptly as it had appeared. I went ashore with my sample, and intended to ask a customs agent about it. The other sailors at the dock were oblivious. They didn't see anything like it on their passage, never in their years of sailing these waters. But luckily, a wizened old man at the docks set me straight before I went insane with conspiracy theories. Turns out, we'd just caught the Great Barrier Reef in its annual orgy. The brown colour in the water was the spore of the reef that it releases all at once across the entire continental shelf of Australia. And this year, in Queensland, we had calm weather with little churning to dissipate the massive cloud of life. When I was 17, myself and two friends, Andrew and Ben, went into an abandoned, condemned mental asylum. We happened to walk past it and noticed a side door was open, so took the opportunity to explore. It was just a 2-story wing of the building, but was pretty impressive. Lots of trash, old chairs and paperwork, pink painted walls, and lots of cells along one side of the building. Anyway, Andrew decides to walk into a cell, and Ben thought it would be funny to slam the door shut, locking Andrew inside. We couldn't open it. It had no handle on the door and was nearly 10 centimeters thick. There was no window or one of those little sliding flaps, just a few tiny air holes arranged in a circle that we could talk through. Obviously Andrew is freaking out, swearing at us, kicking at the inside of the door and screaming to get him out. Ben starts crying and is just shut down. I told him to leave and try to find help, as he was having a breakdown, which caused Andrew to start crying too. For about an hour, I tried everything to get the door open. I found metal bars lying around and tried to pry the door. It didn't move. There was nothing raised on the door to grab hold of, and there was nothing I could do to shift it. I mean, it's a cell door. This thing isn't intended to be forced open. I eventually realized no one has turned up. Ben must have just gone home and not told anyone. I had to keep telling Andrew that I needed to get help, but he refused to stay there alone and made me promise to try again to break the cell and not leave. I knew this door wasn't coming open. I just made noise banging on the door with metal bars, and made it seem like to Andrew that I was getting somewhere. I smashed out pieces of the wall near the doorframe, and broke a bit of the doorframe, but it was useless. Honestly, I had given up and was waiting for someone to arrive, like firefighters or something. Andrew was going berserk. He had stopped sounding scared and sat and was extremely enraged. He was screaming, and it was so loud it hurt my ears. I was getting pissed off at him and was trying to break down the door. I gave up and just sat down. He burnt himself out pretty quickly with all the screaming. I can't remember how long we waited for, but eventually I hear a voice yell out from the end of the building, "You've just been caught breaking and entering." A security guard was standing at the entrance of the large cell room. Seeing the guy was a bolt of energy for me. I started yelling about how my friend was stuck in there and helped me open the door, but he seemed nervous to enter the cell room. He wanted me to come over to him. I wasn't walking over to him, and I continued to yell at him that he had to help. He tiptoes over to me to the cell door, tiptoes like the floor's made of lava, which I thought was bizarre. Anyway, the guard seemed like he wanted to be a dick about it, saying things like, "We'll have to wait till the police and owners arrive before we can get you out." Andrew gave him hell, and the security guard comes up with a plan to check all the other cells in the buildings for a key or handle that's inserted to open the doors. The guard found one. It was in a cell in another story, which basically looked like a massive iron key with a square socket on one end, plugged into a small square hole near the door frame, and the door popped open. The story, after all that, goes like this. Police and owners wanted charges laid for trespassing and damages to the property. I wrote a huge letter to the owners, saying the door was open, and how negligent it was allowing children to access a condemned building with no signage or security. I also mentioned how traumatic the event was for us children, and for one of us to be locked in a cell. I was bullshitting, sucking up and all that, and all charges were eventually dropped, because I think they were scared for the negligence and endangerment of children part. The security guard told me that under the cell rooms were the old steam laundry for the asylum, and that the floors we were standing on were rotted. That's why he didn't want to walk into the room. Andrew got a huge rep at school, like he was some huge badass, but he never said thank you to me for writing the letter, getting the charges dropped, or for sticking by him to get him out. Ben did just run home and cried. No one ever knew he was there. The creepiest part of it all? After we'd opened the cell, the inside of the door had scratch marks on it. They were about head height and looked like they were caused by human nail. I never worked out if they were from patients when the asylum was in use, or if it was from Andrew growing crazy in that cell. I haven't spoken to either of them since high school ended. Andrew got a kick out of the attention it gave him. His yearbook quote even mentions it like some messed up badge. I think that's why he didn't actually ever confront Ben or acknowledged how much I helped. But I know the truth. They were both crying like little girls. A couple of years ago, I was sailing on a ship that maneuvered offshore with pipeline that ran to shore about half a mile off. As the ship was unhooking from the pipe, the line that was used to haul the pipe to the ship connection got wrapped around a person's leg and sucked him through the rails. He fell about 30 feet into freezing water, and the general alarm sounded for a man overboard, which woke me up at around 5. I woke up all confused to find everyone frantically running around on deck. Once I realized it was no drill, I ran to the starboard side, and there were around 3 life rings in the water, and one was around 3 feet from the guy, but he couldn't reach it. He had a work vest on that was keeping him afloat. Hypothermia had set in, and he was moving slow and was yelling for help. At this point it was clear he wasn't grabbing the life rings, so half the crew and I ran over to the rescue boat to unhook it, while the other half tried getting him on the ship. It seemed like it took forever to get the rescue boat down. The hold-down straps were rusted and took a bit to get off. The cover was still on the boat, and it was a bitch to get off. And the hoist is the slowest hoist, which seemed to take 10 minutes to finally get into the water. Finally, we get 2 guys in the rescue boat, in the water, and let the bow line off. And then the rescue boat engine cuts out. Luckily, it started right up again. At that point, I ran back to the starboard side, and everyone was yelling, "Where is he?" One of the mates said, "We had him on the ladder, but his leg is still caught in that line. We couldn't get it free, and he got sucked under the ship." At this point, everyone seemed to go silent. I looked down and saw the guy's boot float by. The next guy came to me and said, "He's gone." After a few nerve-wracking seconds, the crew in the rescue boat radioed that they found the guy bobbing in the water face down and still attached to the hoist line. He was unconscious and not breathing. At this point, the rescue crew tried pulling the guy on board, and with the swell of the sea and the way the boat hit his chest, made him spit up water and come to. The radio crew radioed back that he was conscious. The line was removed from his leg, and he was pulled fully onto the boat. The boat headed straight to shore where the beach crew and an ambulance were waiting. They were able to get the guy some coats and put them on him, and he was conscious enough to understand what was going on but not to speak. The ambulance took him, where he was sent to the ER for hypothermia and drowning. The guy's life vest saved his life in more ways than one. It kept him afloat and kept him visible. I say it kept him visible because if you blinked and he didn't have a life vest on, you would have never seen him again. Things luckily didn't result in a death, but easily could have, due to the temperature of water, visibility, equipment failure and reaction time. This is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me while sailing, and the look of terror on the guy's face is still with me, and the feeling of utter hopelessness to help, even though he was a mere few feet from the ship. He spent a few days in the hospital, and miraculously suffered no serious injuries, except near death. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I love listening to the sound of rain, even though it doesn't really help much when recording. I find it so relaxing. And remember that if you enjoyed today's video, please consider dropping a like and leaving a comment, as it's a really great way to help support the channel and I appreciate it tremendously. And if you'd like to do something incredible to help support the channel further, feel free to visit my Patreon. You can find a link in the description as well as the links to my social media. And if you'd like your story read on my channel, you can submit it as a text post to my Reddit page or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.